Welcome, everyone, back to the Heights podcast. Today we have a special guest, our first guest, Matthew Hayes. Are you from Nashville, Matthew?
I spent my high school years here. Yeah.
Okay.
Middle school and high school.
Cool. So I moved to Nashville just over a year ago and was trying to get connected with people. And he was one of the first people that met with me. We had coffee, and ever since then I looked up to him. He, every week, has this basketball group with guys and prays with them. And before and after, they get on their knees and they pray, and then we have a lot of fun. So I did it a couple times, then life got a little hectic, but ever since then I looked up to this guy and I was like, I got to have him on. I'd love to have him on. So Matthew, first just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Man. Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here. I mean, holy cow, humbled for sure to be thought of that way. Who am I, right? It's an interesting question, right? Because I feel like in our modern culture, the first thing we ask is like, so what do you do?
Yeah.
Right? And so I think I was talking to you a little bit about identity and what does that mean? And I feel like in so many different regards, that's a major component of what I think you and I were hoping to talk about today. It's like, who are you? Yeah. What does that mean? So I think for me, who am I is kind of a couple different things, right? So first, I'm a son. Mm-hmm. Then I'm a husband, a father, a friend. And then I have this job, right, that I do. But so oftentimes in my daily world, I can think of myself more as like what I do. Mm-hmm. So who am I? I'm married to Lindsay, so I'm the husband of Lindsay. We've been married for almost 10 years now, which is wild to think. We have 5 beautiful kids. Oldest, Ada Grace, turned 9 2 days ago, which is pretty sweet. And then we have 3 boys in between her, Levi, Abram, and Leo. And then we just welcomed our 5th child, Joe Claire, 3 months ago. So
congrats.
Thanks, man. So married, husband, father. I'm also a revert is the way that I would put it, in the sense that grew up in the church, very much was blessed with wonderful parents, faithful parents who, mass every Sunday, prayer before meals, prayer at night as a family. That was very much rooted and ingrained in who we were. Was involved in my faith all throughout high school in terms of being very involved in my church, involved in FCA, all of those kinds of components. And then, going to college, the luster of the world caught hold of me, and I got selfish and cowardly in a lot of different ways. Yeah. And just lost track and went off the road, and that led to a lot of decay in my life and a lot of, as sin does, right? Mm-hmm. And through God's grace and divine providence, there was an encounter in a major moment in my life in a place of really darkness and despair. So in the midst of a quasi-suicide attempt, just had God throw me off track of that in a way that I can't articulate any other way than experiencing the hand of God in my life. And that began a reversion for me. And I say began because I would say I'm still reverting now, right? Yeah. And in the sense of like, and this is what's so incredibly wonderful and beautiful, is God in his intimacy and his grace, like both met me where I was and continued to call me into something more, but was patient with me and merciful with me, and allowed that reversion to take place in his time. And kind of he met me where I was, which was not in the best of places. So slowly and surely over time, that continued to move and grow, but culminated, I would say, when I met my wife, which many of my friends know helped me to kind of come full circle with Catholicism and the magisterium of the church in a lot of different ways, in the sense of how I experienced my faith and understanding the full presence in the Eucharist and how Jesus encounters us in the Eucharist and everything else. So it's probably a deeper when that happened.
How old were you when the reversion happened, the encounter and the calling out?
Yeah, the encounter happened when I was like 19, 18. Yeah, 19. Okay. And then it's been a full-blown thing ever since. So short story, reversion. And then I started at the University of Georgia. I thought at the time, like, oh, well, school was the problem, and through a lot of good counseling and spiritual direction, no, you were the problem. Right.
Yeah.
And so went back to school for 6 months and worked on reconciling, like, both with myself, with God, and with some friends, and relationships that I'd had where, maybe I hadn't treated them the best, or hadn't done truth by them. Right.
Yeah.
And so then took some time off. I lived in Liberia in West Africa on a Catholic mission for a semester, which was life-changing.
Yeah.
Came back, went to MTSU, worked full-time, did Young Life at Holy Family, which is a parish south of town, and involved in a couple other nonprofits and ministries in town. And then I spent my last 2 years of college at LSU, which is where I met my wife last week of school. So I had all these intentions after graduating, and met her, and things changed, right?
Yeah.
So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's wow. So I'm sure the calling out was also a calling out of your masculinity, what it means to be man. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about in this conversation, is what real masculinity is, but in particular, Into the Breach, which I only saw the Knights of Columbus, which is really the videos discuss brotherhood, the meaning of brotherhood, the meaning of fatherhood, what it means to be a husband and a good dad. And so let's dive into that. And even if you want to talk about your own story of the transition from maybe being a boy, because I remember I had a mentor who basically said, Brendan, like, you're being a boy, and a boy is living for yourself, but a man lives for others. And it was this, like, calling me out. And so maybe if you want to talk about your own journey as well, but maybe first talk about what is Into the Breach. When did you encounter it, and what did that do to you?
Sure, yeah. So I'll try to bring this full circle. But first, Into the Breach is an apostolic exhortation that at the time the Bishop of Phoenix, Bishop Olmsted, put out to his diocese. And more or less, it's a call to battle. It's the calling out that we live in a culture, in a time, in a place where our faith is under attack, our souls are under attack, and quite often, as men, like you said, masculinity is under attack in a lot of different ways. It was a calling of arms, right? So a clarion call to battle is, I think, the first line that he puts in there.
Oh, wow.
In terms of, hey, men, you are needed, and there is a battle that is worthy. It is both a battle that we face internally, right? So how am I taking responsibility? How am I laying down my life following after Christ?
Yeah.
How am I picking up my own crosses?
Yeah.
And then at the same time, it's a battle externally too, right? We live in a time and a place where the culture war is real. Mm-hmm. So how are we stepping into that? But we can only do that if we're also battling within. Like if we are working as Christ calls us to lay down our life, pick up our cross, repent, turn to Him, all those other things. So that's Into the Breach, and we'll cover that in a little bit. I was first exposed to it. Bishop Olmsted put this out on the Feast of the Archangels in 2015. Okay. And I've been very blessed. I mentioned my wife really was like the impetus of full circle into the magisterium of the church. And when we moved here to Nashville in 2014, we were very blessed to, find ourselves through a myriad of events with an incredibly potent and fruitful group of community. So a number of couples that were going through the same stage of life, either recently married or expecting their first kid, somewhere in that framework. Just to give you kind of an idea. So when we started, that was end of 2014, right? I think there were 7 couples. We had 1 or 2 kids at the time, and now we're 9 couples and like 45 kids. So it's a beautiful, crazy mess, as family life is. But that group of friends, one of the dads in that group threw out this apostolic exhortation in like our group chat or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it was like, hey, this would be a worthy thing for us to all go through. And I don't think he realized how impactful it would have been for each of us individually or each of us as a group, because it very much began this identity, kind of like we began with, of who are we as sons, husbands, fathers, friends, but then also how are we framing that up? I mean, this is a good group of guys in the sense that everyone was trying to seek a strong relationship with Christ. Everyone was seeking to live in alignment with the magisterium of the church. Everyone was seeking to live to hopefully love their wives well and love their kids well, right? But I think this really teed it up and gave us some structure and gave us some focus and clarity of what that looked like and how that might be played out. You also said something about, I love the way you put this, or that mentor put this, about like, hey, you're being a boy. And I think if I'm honest with myself, that is what happened, right? So in high school, whether it was intentional or intentional, I had found myself in this place of leadership, of kind of seeing myself as like, hey, what I do matters and what I don't do matters. Meaning that like I tried to live a certain way, and I fell short all the time. But like I knew that how I lived mattered, not just for myself but for others. And then it was this desire to not care about that anymore, or kind of not deal with that anymore, or kind of the boyhood, like I just don't want any responsibility with that. I just want to go have fun.
Yeah.
That
careless,
was
and maybe it's careless. Like,
right?
Who cares what I'm just
going to do me.
Yeah.
Right. And it was that apathy or lack of taking responsibility, or shedding of responsibility, that ultimately led to, not loving others, that led to not loving myself, that led to not loving God in my actions and in how I was conducting myself and everything else, right? And that spiritual decay for sure. And I think, that is also part of why the decay settled in, because it was the lie of, as men, because I have heard a similar thing too. It's like, okay, when you transition from a boy to a man, and it's when you're able to take responsibility. It's like when you realize that I am responsible, right? Or there are things that I am to be responsible for. That fatherhood, that moving into a man of thought, mind, deed, action, identity. And so I would, kind of your question around like, what was that experience for me? It was that of kind of moving from knowing that I needed to take responsibility to avoiding responsibility, living kind of carelessly or selfishly, however you want to call that, a little bit of both.
Yeah.
And then coming back to terms through God's grace of, man, like just his voice was so strong and loving of like, yeah, you messed up, but I'm big, but I'm bigger than your mess up.
Yeah.
And don't doubt that for a second. And you can fight or you can quit. And, you should fight.
Yeah.
And so I think moving back into it was learning how to regain the trust of, I am broken, but he is bigger, right? So trusting who God is rather than on my own fallibilities and failures. And then also just like picking it up one step at a time, one day at a time, because as we're talking about with masculinity, it is starting to take more responsibility, right? And so I think that began a journey for masculinity, and my time in Liberia definitely solidified that too, of taking responsibility and learning what it means to not just live for yourself, so to say.
Yeah.
And
Why? So when I look at things on the media, it's as if living for yourself is idolized. That what will bring you fulfillment and happiness, don't do what anyone else says. Like, you do you, be you. And whether that's money, whether that's, hey, don't settle down. I mean, you're going to lose your freedom, and gosh, the burden of all that goes, no, just live for yourself. I see that idolized. Whether that's getting the nice car, getting the nice house, nice jewelry. But what you're saying is, no, actually what you learned is that what it means to be a man is actually a part of losing yourself, losing your life for the sake of others. Responsibility, not just living for myself. So this could be a hard question, but it's like, why do you think the idea of responsibility to the culture is just not attractive? And what's attractive is, I mean, maybe that's just my own thought of what I'm saying, but of like, just live for yourself. That's what.
Man, I love your question. I think it's so deep, and I want to attack it like 12 different philosophical ways. But And I feel like we could spend the entirety of our conversation on that point, but
Yeah, it's a big question.
it's a big question. It's a good question. And I don't know. I've experienced a couple different things. So I want to try to say like what maybe I experienced personally and then what I see externally.
Mm-hmm.
I think the lie is things like material will make you happy or comfort will make you happy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if in the world we experience discomfort or suffering, that is what is the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not. That's a lie, right? I mean, we're all bound. We live in a fallen world. We live in a world where we're in a temporal place. Like, there's suffering all around us. You can't escape suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, we've got our AC, we've got electricity, I've got hot water all the time, right? We've grown used to comfort. And so what we often idolize is comfort and sentimentality and this ability to feel good all the time. Like we want those highs constantly rather than any discomfort. And so I feel like, or I know that often for me in that stage, I wanted to, kind of YOLO. You only live once. Why not experience all that good?
Yeah.
But that good, I would say, is a cheapened good, a short-sighted good, right? And I'll use the example of, we talked about marriage and family already. So like bringing in, and I know this, you live in this world too, right? But theology of the body.
Yeah.
It's like, so you tie in contraceptions versus NFP, right? Mm-hmm. One is an easier way to say, just don't think about it, set it and forget it. The marital act is for babies and bonding. Enjoy the bonding whenever you want without thinking about the babies.
Yeah.
Whereas NFP calls us to live in full communion with not only God, but with our spouse in terms of, I'm not just thinking about this of whenever I want to enjoy it, but this is something that I need to take seriously and earnestly, and something to where the worthy sacrifice of waiting builds both strength and communication between us. What I'm trying to, I guess, draw out in this is we've lost sight of the benefit, the good, the purpose in discomfort or in suffering or in any of those kinds of things that challenge us to rise above, right?
So the word that was coming to my mind was challenged. And I think I read this, John Eldridge, in either Wild at Heart or his wife's book. He says something to the effect of women, there's the feminine heart wants to, the question they ask themselves is, am I lovely? Or am I beautiful? And the question men ask is, can I do it? Or, am I able to do this? And I think the masculine heart, and of course women have this as well, but there's a sense of a challenge, or as Jordan Peterson says, adventure, and that's why he's spoken to so many men. And I remember myself in college, I lived for myself, and I hear a lot of people in fraternities, hey, I'm going to just get it out these 4 years, and then I'll grow up and mature. It's like, it doesn't work that way. You're forming habits and a personality that it doesn't just work that way. Yeah. And I remembered for me, it was a sense of, I'm made for something more. I want to be challenged. I want to grow and mature in that way, and not just, it's not satisfying. It's not enough. So I like what you said there of, we're losing sight of responsibility and being challenged as men. And we're seeing it a lot.
Yeah. I mean, it's all over the place, and it's the avoidance of challenge, right? Or it's challenge in a different kind of way, and we're taking on a different identity. It's more of the ways of the world, where it's what you accumulate, how many ladies you've been with, like whatever you carry that all the way down, right?
Yeah, that's the challenge.
Right, that's the challenge.
First one to 20 women, or first one to $1 million. Yeah.
It's all the accolades, it's that self, but what we avoid then is the actual internal, right? Which is where you see all the ramifications of that get dumped on everybody else and dumped on ourselves, like really long term. But I think to your point of challenge and adventure, we all inherently as men really do yearn for that. I mean, and so how do I see that? What's the lens in which I interpret what adventure is? And again, this, in my mind, goes back to identity, right? Whereas maybe in college, to use your example, it was the adventure is having fun, right?
Yeah.
Whereas now the adventure is, man, what does it mean to love and to be loved? And what does it mean to hopefully surrender my children to God, because they are gifts that he's entrusted me with. They're not just mine. But then secondly, to try to put them in a position where I'm not either overprotecting them, right? Yeah. Which can also be disabling, or not accompanying them, right? There's like this balance between the two. Because if I'm not walking with them, then they don't know love, or they don't know that they're protected, or they don't know any of these other elements. But if I'm doing everything for them, then I'm also hindering them from experiencing the world themselves, experiencing adventure themselves, experiencing how to take care of themselves or to initiate on their own as well, right? And so there's this adventure has changed in the sense of what once was for myself, and this is kind of the beginning of the conversation that awesome point you had earlier. It's like what once was for myself and taking responsibility and everything. You realize that's cheap. You start realizing there's a greater challenge, a greater good to be found in laying down your life and living for others and living for a greater purpose than what is just me and what I can receive and internalize and everything else.
Yeah. Okay, so the question I have is, we've been talking a little bit about the battle, the battle within, the battle without. So as a husband, as a father, trying to live in first your identity, as you said, as a son, beloved son of the Father. That's your deepest identity as a man. So what has been the battle, or maybe the battle is the same for every man, or maybe in particular with you, with your family and being a husband. What is that battle? And how do you go about fighting it?
What is that battle? I think first and foremost, for me, I can only express like for where I'm at today, the 19th of August, 2023 it's really that identity question. Because often I'm in a place in my life, I'm 34 years old, we have 5 kids, I'm 10 plus years into my career, right? Where I can get trapped in that, like, so what do you do? Right? Place of my identity is tied up in what I'm doing or performing, even if it's for my family or for my wife, or even if it's for this, that, or the other. Sometimes turning that off when I come home and just being like resting in throughout the entirety of my day where my identity is, that can be a challenging thing. So the battle within, I think, most foundationally begins with, am I a son of the Father? I would say that's where it begins. It's not where it ends, but that's where it begins of, am I living from a place where that's my deepest identity? And everything that I'm encountering, whether it be with work, with my kids, with my wife, like that's my deepest identity. Because if I'm looking for, which I can often do, so often do, ask my bride, ask my coworkers, I can look for affirmation from all these other things, right? Like I can look for those hits of affirmation from things that happen at work or from my wife. It's like I can put my emotional needs on her for sure, right? Or whatever it may be. But if I'm truly living in my masculinity and my identity as a son of God, that's where I should be. And not to say that you don't need to live in communion with your spouse, not to say that you don't affect one another, not to say you don't have to be mindful of each other, but no matter what season that we're in, especially like we looked at the lives of the saints, right? There's this first place of anywhere that's led to fruit of understanding that my truest identity, where I rest, is in my relationship with God. And it's only from that I can then go out into the world and engage and interact, right? So then from that place, that's where I can grow in virtue, or I can avoid vice, or I can repent of sins that I may carry, right? But it's from that. And so where does the battle go after that? Well, the battle goes to all different kinds of places. But I would say particularly for men, I think a major place that it goes to is chastity and the ability to work on purifying my intentions and my heart. And that's not just, I think, let me also just say this for really quick. I didn't really learn what chastity was until marriage. I thought, okay, great. You practice chastity and then you get to marriage and then like, it's great. But it's so amazing because it's been such a fruitful thing. And it's taught me how to like love my wife for who she is, and we know this inherently deep down that like sex is not the end all be all of your marriage. And I think, but then when you begin to experience that, oh my gosh, the biggest fruit, the best fruit comes from that communion of emotional intimacy, of spiritual intimacy, of the ability to be aligned with each other in where God is calling us individually or as a family, or, that is far superior to anything, that you would experience otherwise. And that's a beautiful thing. So the battle for chastity, the battle against lust, right? Whether that's lusting for a person of the opposite sex or in a sexual way, or whether that is lusting for material things like my neighbor has that sweet car, or my neighbor's got 3 properties, one he's renting out, one he's doing this. I think this temptation of yearning for something else is something that we battle particularly with our common society today. And then I would also say, we can take that in so many different routes of vices that we're working through or whatnot, but those are 2 I think that stick out pretty quickly to me.
Yeah. It's interesting that the battle, and I'm sure this, you probably Into the Breach influence that is first within. It's not, typically it's, we're going to go out, we're going to go evangelize and the culture's crazy. And so we're going to go change the world. Let's go. No, actually, primarily it's within myself and all the places of my heart that doubt that I'm a beloved, that I need to hear the Father say, you're beloved there, you're beloved there. And then through that, it then just overflows. And then you even brought up, okay, virtue, like versus vice. And even just chastity. It's like, I loved what you said earlier, that learning to go on the adventure of loving and being loved. And like chastity, what is that? It's a virtue that integrates your sexuality to love rightly. Like that, wow, that's beautiful. It's not this negative, repressive thing. Or just even being envious or jealous of your neighbor. It's integrating love into that, to have a right intention or to see your neighbor in the right way. And so that's really interesting because I remember Bill Donahue, who works at the Theology Body Institute, he talks a lot about we're human beings, not human doings.
Correct.
And I think that's very interesting that a lot of people are getting, and I do at times, where I get my worth, value, affirmation from my job, from what people say about me, rather than, no, I'm first a beloved son. I don't have to do anything, and I'm a man, just by knowing I'm beloved, rather than, oh, your masculinity is determined by what you do. That flows out of knowing who you are, and what will flow out is love or living for others. Yeah. And so that changes things.
It does. It does. And I think as you were talking, one of the things that hit me was kind of, again, the adventure of loving others, right? And learning how to view it as that. One of the things I love about adventure is like, you don't know where you're going, right? A lot of times, or you end up somewhere where you weren't expecting. Yeah. Right. And so the sanguine part of me loves that. Yeah. But there's other parts of me that just, oh man, it wrecks me. And one place that I was not prepared for as a man was vulnerability. Like learning how to be vulnerable with my wife. Like, holy cow. Like, that's torturous. Because like now I'm feeling my feelings and I'm putting it out there, and it's like, what if you don't respond? I don't like that. But yet the reality is, as men, especially if you're in a marriage, like oftentimes you're either gonna wall up, which is what I did for a few years, which was, I don't suggest. It didn't turn out well. Yeah. Or we just put everything on our shoulder and like keep moving on. And that's not good either. Did that for a couple years too. And then that ends up, you're on two opposite pages. The adventure of learning how to, and this is like where Christ again is just the optimal example, like the quintessence example of being vulnerable. Like he who is God enters into our mess and like is getting spit on. And I mean, just the vulnerability of, and he experienced love and friendship and disappointment and all of these other things as well.
Yeah.
And as men, learning how to be vulnerable was part of the adventure with my bride, just for men who are going to get married, right? I didn't expect that one. I didn't want that one. And yet I find myself leaning into that one or having to lean into it because when you avoid it, it turns out poorly. And so learning how to let my wife into places and do so in a way that's healthy for both of us is part of the adventure that I didn't foresee. But that was what first popped up in my mind. I want to take something else you said, kind of another route, if you're cool with it, which is
cool.
living, kind of understanding that identity within and then being able to go without. You talked about that basketball group where you and I first met, right?
Yeah.
So that is a continuation of Exodus 90. So I'm sure, I know you know what Exodus is and many other people will know what Exodus is, but it's an awesome journey where we're invited to pick up some tenets, right? We're invited to pick up, again, 3 tenets that have been core to the church for a really long time, yet in our common living of the world, they don't often go hand in hand with what it means to be a Christian or what it means to be a Catholic, which are prayer, asceticism, and fraternity. Now, asceticism really is more likened to training, right? Which is, how am I denying myself? How am I training in the form of spirituality and faith, which means that I'm laying down my life in certain regards in order for this greater good, right?
Yeah.
But it also has 2 others, which are prayer and fraternity, which you cannot ignore. And if you want to riff on that, then we can take it another place. But.
Yeah. No, I'd love to hear you keep going, but just even when I hear asceticism, like even in myself, there's a, oh, well, that's lame. Like, but okay, no, imagine someone who's training for any sport. You have to deny yourself in order for a goal that you're trying to achieve, or, it's a challenge. And so, yeah, that was my only thought, but mention the prayer fraternity. Why?
Yeah. Well, I actually want to reel off what you were saying now, because I think you're right. Like, oftentimes you look at asceticism as, I don't want to deal with that, or it's lame, or however else we carry it. I think the difficult part for us as Catholics too is like it can become a checklist and a pride filler, right?
Yeah.
Of like, and at least, so I went through Exodus, I think three or 4 times, and the first time I was more self-focused than fully surrendered, which is the goal of it, is to be more surrendered and dependent on God. But it became this checklist for me, like, oh yeah, I can accomplish all these things, right? And
I did Exodus once. Yeah. Or it's like, oh, you snapped today? I didn't.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just rubbing it. It's competition.
I did.
Which is, as guys, like, it's our tank fill, right? It's like, yeah, I'm a good guy. Like I can do this, whatever.
Exactly. Can I do it?
But I can do it, right?
Yeah.
Rather than which Exodus is meant for, which is God is doing it, which is the whole purpose of Exodus, right? It's like, it's Him who's called us rather than we who have, we get to respond, but He is the one who is calling, right? It's Him who initiates it.
Yeah.
And then we have the opportunity to respond, or first to receive, then to respond, which is, men, receiving is a really hard thing for us anyway. But yeah, so basketball started out of, basically we had the Exodus group. We went through that for a long time. And then some of our guys in Exodus said, hey, like, how do we keep brotherhood, fraternity going? And as men, oftentimes it's more difficult for us just to like hang out and chat. We generally need something to do, right? And so the concept with basketball was, hey, what's something where we can go have fun, like get a little workout in, feel like we're doing something, and at the same time provide the space and place to where we can have real meaningful spiritual discussions, talk about prayer requests, where are we struggling, bunker time, which again lines up with Into the Breach, and Exodus, which is this call to fraternity, this call to brotherhood, this call to we can't do it alone. And when we try to do it alone, that's when we get isolated and Satan just has a field day, right? But it's this idea of we're in the battle together, and we call it bunker time intentionally because it's like this is a little breather. Like this is a spot where you can get recharged, have a quick rest, and then you can jump back into the battle because we're all in the same battle together.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
We need brotherhood. Mm-hmm. Even if I'm not married, you're a married man, we both still need brotherhood. It might look a little different in the sense of you have to devote your time more to your family.
Yep.
But you also need brotherhood. Why? To help you be formed as a good brother, as a good husband, as a good father. And then,
Well, just to like carry on your point there, it's like, funny enough, me and my wife were having this discussion earlier today. It's like she and I both have gifts, but we also have weaknesses.
Yeah.
Right. And as a father, as a husband, it's the same thing. It's like I have places where I'm exceptional and places where I'm terrible, like where I'm deficient.
Yeah.
And part of the gift of this group of brothers that I have, and I've told all of them, it's like, man, the blessing of each of you in my life is that so many of you have different gifts than I do. And I want my kids exposed to that. Like, because I trust you.
Yeah.
And I trust who you're seeking in Christ. And I trust the intentions of your heart. And so to know that my kids get exposure to those gifts too, because they're uniquely, beautifully made. They're not just little replicas of me, right?
Yeah.
So I can only give them so much. And so to have the opportunity to your point of like, I need to be formed and challenged in ways that make me become a better holistic man, play to my strengths, deal with my weaknesses. But at the same time, we're better together. Like we're made as a church, right? What St. Paul tells us, like we're one body, but many parts, and we all need each other. And so the idea of brotherhood is also that forming, strengthening, which can be, yes, if I'm an individual, if I'm a single male or a single female, but also in married life, it's the same thing. Because as an individual, I have strengths and weaknesses, and the ability to surround yourself with others that are going to complement, challenge, push you forward in those places is a really fruitful thing.
In my fraternity back in college in my fraternity back in college, a lot of the friends that I had, it was more just for here and now. And what was the direction that we're going in? There was no direction. When I began to get more involved in my Catholic faith, the men had a vision. This is where I want to go. And we all had the same exact vision that we could aim for, challenge for. And I think that it almost felt like when I was in the fraternity, like a free for all. And there wasn't, who am I? It was just more confusing. Whereas, okay, where do I find my identity? Where am I going? Okay, only the Father in heaven reveals that to me. This is who you are, and this is what you're made for. Okay, now I have a picture of and then I look at myself. Am I there? Heck no, I'm not there. Not even close. But okay, there's a group of guys that can help me, get there. And then it's like, okay, I have an aim in my life, which is very freeing. But something I wanted to ask you is, I think a lot of men, well, everyone in general, can beat ourselves up. It could even be like, I'm just so weak, I can't even have the capacity to go pray or battle or even fight this internal battle. What would you say, this is maybe a hard question, but what would you say for those who are maybe really struggling in this battle? Could be an addiction. It could be someone brutally abandoned or rejected them, and they're fighting for the truth of their identity. Because when we get hurt or when we hurt ourselves, that's when the evil one whispers a lie. Look at you. You're not enough. You're terrible. And the battle, as we were talking about, is your identity. And so what would you say to encourage people who are struggling right now? But then maybe that might be just something different to focus on versus someone who maybe life's really good for them right now. But what would you say then in general of what are we called to?
To tie that all together, I think the litany of trust is really beautiful. if you've ever heard of that, or
Yeah.
if anybody's ever dealt with it, but it's a, you go through a myriad of prayers, but Jesus, I trust in you, which is what our whole aim is communion with God, right? What you said hit me intimately, because like I told you about with my reversion, I was in that place like for months upon months of being disgusted with myself and discouraged and be down and wanting to give up, like thinking that the better outcome would be if I wasn't here, right? And hearing all of those lies and those whispers, and I can't take credit for it. It was purely grace. And again, like we go back to in God's providence. So we go back to Exodus, or we go back to this exhortation or anything else. It's God chooses us. God is calling us. And oftentimes it's receiving that. But learning how to parse through those lies, it's really tough, especially when you're in that place and what you're experiencing is real, but his love is bigger. And so the counterpunch that I would say to what you're throwing out is probably a couple different things. Is one, any chance to go to confession? Like reconciliation is a real thing. It's a victory seat, not a timeout box, right? Which I didn't understand for a long time. I didn't understand. And then I'd say I'd say time with our Lord, like in the Blessed Sacrament, not having to say anything, like, and honestly being real with him, because he can take it. So where am I at? Man, I'm struggling.
Yeah.
I don't even know where you are. Like, where are you? And I'm having trouble. Like, help me to do that. Like being honest with God and inviting him into wherever I'm at. I think oftentimes we like to hide, and that's what I know I was doing is I didn't feel worthy, and I hid, or I ran away. Mm-hmm. And yet we're more isolated and we're more vulnerable to attack, right? Mm-hmm. And so I'd say allowing God into wherever that place is, and then within that as well, those are two specific. So the litany of trust, which is incredible. And then also I would say the surrender novena, which is a really good one too, of Jesus, I surrender myself to you. You take care of everything, is the prayer that you continually repeat. There's a myriad of other things that you're meditating on, but I may not believe that the first few times that I say it. I might not believe it the 1,000th time that I say it, but it's leaning into and inviting God into, because again, back to God initiates the call. We can then either receive or respond. It is us making the effort to respond, and then whether I'm able to trust from a mental place or from an ontological place, it's putting into action that effort of trust, because that's the relationship that we're going after.
Yeah, that's interesting. What you just said, effort of trust, or I've heard it like I've heard the saying called active receptivity. That there's a difference between I'm passive versus I'm internally going to consent to open and allow God in, and that takes effort.
Exactly.
And it's a struggle.
Exactly.
But the posture's let it be.
And it's one of the biggest challenges, we talk about adventure and challenge, like that is a major one, especially for us men, because it's learning how to receive.
Yeah.
And again, it's not my doing, it's my being.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I am learning to open up and allow God to touch all of that brokenness that I'm afraid of.
Yeah.
and all of the places where I don't feel capable or worthy, or like I'm providing, or I'm too weak, all of these other things that our masculinity gets attacked on.
Yeah.
It's a difficult place to lean into. And yet, we know that when we're weak, he is strong. And learning how to invite him in strengthens those muscles of trust.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of things are popping in my mind. When you mentioned vulnerability, that it was hard, what came to my mind, it's something that I learned, it's kind of cool. The Latin word for vulnerability means like wounding, or the capacity to be wounded. And so, yeah, you only open up and be vulnerable when you know that someone will meet you there and love you there. And so we can do that with God, because he's a loving Father. So that was the first thing that was popping in my mind. The second thing was this, I can do, I want to hear my Father say, you can do it. What I've learned on the spiritual journey is that there's a part where it's like, no, I can't do anything.
That's right.
And even Aquinas, he says there's different levels of graces, extraordinary, or even just this right here is a grace. He's sustaining us. Me going up to pray is a grace. It's not me doing. I'm cooperating with him. But something that I've learned is like, and that's okay for a man to say that. I need help, or I need God's grace. Like, that's actually more masculine, or more of being who you truly are as a man, as a beloved son. And then he can call you out and, I want to help you. I want to challenge you. Let's go on an adventure together. But that's a totally different way of looking at.
It is, because our culture tells us it's all about you, right? It's all about me.
Yeah.
And yet what you're articulating is inherently the adventure. When we think about like knights running to battle, or when we think about, days before where people were literally, what makes me a man is my willingness to lay down my life, to be seen as a part of this bigger cause.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the same thing of, Lord, I can't do it, but you are doing something.
Yeah.
And I surrender to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same thing of laying down your life. It's the same thing of making it not about me, but protecting the fort, or protecting the church, or protecting my family, or protecting my wife. But it's a totally different way of looking at it. But it's the same it's the same principle of, it's not about me. Like, and my dying can be fruit for something else.
Yeah.
And there's purpose in that. And so going back again to whether that's being wounded in my pride of like, I want to do it, or I want to be sufficient, or whatever it may be, that's one kind of wounding. But the other kind of wounding, like you're saying, as men, like learning how to allow God to do it.
Yeah.
And really lay down my life for not telling him what I want him to do, right? But actually inviting him in and asking him, hey, what's your will here?
Yeah.
And this is where I'm at, and you take it and you do with it what you want to do.
Yeah. And I hope every person looks at someone, say it's this thing popped in my mind. When I was teaching at a high school, I asked all the students, and I've done this a lot, who is the man, the woman you want to be, and who do you look up to right now that you want to be like them? And every person they say, it's someone who is laying their life down. Life's not about me. It's about giving of myself. So I do believe the human heart knows that there's something beautiful and good about that. I mean, Titanic. Jack lays his life down. Iron Man. I don't know if you've ever, spoiler, I don't know if you've seen Avengers Endgame. If not, sorry. He lays his life down. And some of the most popular movies are about someone laying their life down. And I know, even if no one's talking about it, deep down in the heart, I want to be able to do that. There's something beautiful in that. So, but I don't know why it's not being talked about. But I think there are a part of, when I was living for myself, other people living for themselves, you may be joking around and hanging out, but deep down there is something. I do believe that. And if you're not hearing it or feeling it, maybe it's under a lot of rocks and dirt. But yeah, that's Benedict. I'm not made for comfort. I'm made for greatness.
Yeah.
I think every person would hear that line and be like, wow, cool. Well, what does that mean then? But is there, before we kind of conclude here, is there anything either off of that or something that you want to share that we've touched on, one last kind of final point or encouragement that you want to make?
I like the way you ended it with Benedict.
Okay.
I mean, but I think because it's funny, like that was a big part of my reversion too, and something that I almost brought up earlier, but I'm so glad you brought it up when you did, because the first part of that quote is, the world will call you for comfort, but you were not called for comfort. You were called for greatness.
Yeah.
Right. And unless we remember, like to your point, there's rocks, right? There's rocks covering that inherent truth that we know deep within, that we weren't called for that.
Yeah.
Like there is something more beautiful in the giving, in the dying. There is something more fulfilling, more satisfying, right? And yet the world teaches us comfort, but that's not what we were called for.
Called for greatness.
Yeah.
Amen. I want to share one last thing. because you said it multiple times in your thing, and this can kind of conclude it.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you saw these, but we've got bracelets. And we wanted something where, okay, what could we give out, just kind of hand out to people that they can look down every day and there's a reminder of who they are, the battle. And you said multiple times, we need to receive and then respond. I don't know if you probably haven't seen these.
Yeah.
So these are remember, receive, respond bracelets.
That's
this is
pretty
actually our
sweet.
slogan.
That's pretty
to
cool.
where it's, Mufasa says to Simba, remember who you are. Calling him back with it. Look inside yourself, Simba. Like, this is what we're talking about. It's
Absolutely.
like, is that Disney? Was it, right? Did that Disney create Lion King?
Yeah, they did.
Well, Disney's kind of, we know about Disney today. But Lion King, remember who you are. So you can remember who you are, then you can receive from the Father your identity.
Yeah.
And through that reception, you can respond to who you are.
That's pretty sweet.
So that was kind of, when you mentioned receive, respond twice, I was like, I gotta at least mention it.
Hey,
But,
I like it, man.
Yeah.
Those are great bracelets.
Yeah. So thank you guys for joining us. Matthew, thank you
My
for
pleasure.
coming on. You're a good man.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So if you enjoyed it, feel free to share it with any of your family or friends, and we hope to see you next time. Peace.